Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Teniola Oyetayo. Russian President Vladimir Putin has signed documents to incorporate 4 Ukrainian territories into Russia in a televised ceremony in the Kremlin. In an angry speech decrying the West, he claimed people living in the regions had made their choice, but referendums held there have been labeled as shams. The territory being seized is in Russian-held Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions. The ceremony took place 3 days after the completion of referendums in which Moscow-backed officials in the occupied regions claimed majorities of up to 99% in favor of joining Russia. Ukraine and Western governments say the votes, announced only 10 days ago, had been conducted at gunpoint and were a sham. And just before the signing of the annexation documents, Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Russian-backed heads of 4 Ukrainian regions, partly occupied by his forces, clasped hands and chanted, "Russia, Russia," in unison with hundreds of dignitaries in Moscow. Ukraine, the United States, and the head of the United Nations have all said the annexation ceremony would have no legal value. Reactions have been trailing Russia's annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions. Just a few minutes ago, the United States announced it has imposed new sanctions on Russia as a result of its latest move. The U.S. Treasury Department says it's targeting the military-industrial complex behind the war in Ukraine, including 2 international suppliers, 3 leaders of Russia's financial infrastructure, immediate family members of some senior Russian officials, and 278 members of Russia's legislature for enabling the move. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says the United States will not stand by as President Putin fraudulently attempts to annex parts of Ukraine. She adds that the U.S. and its allies will not hesitate to take severe actions against people and companies inside and outside of Russia who were complicit in the war and the referendums. Meanwhile, the European Council, which brings together EU leaders, has said they firmly reject and condemn Russia's annexation of Ukrainian territories, which, according to them, has no legal impact. In the last hour, President Putin has hosted a signing ceremony and made a speech celebrating the seizing of 4 regions in Ukraine, including Russian-held parts of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. The European Council accuses Russia of blatantly violating the fundamental rights of Ukraine to independence.
President Putin has decided on Russia's illegal annexation of the Ukrainian regions of Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. And this annexation follows sham referenda. It is a dangerous and irresponsible escalation. It's designed as a step to intensify the nuclear threat against the rest of the world. The European Union unequivocally rejects and condemns these illegal annexations, and it will never recognize them, just as it did not recognize the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Ukraine and the Ukrainians are under attack, and it's also an aggression against our fundamental freedoms and democratic principles. Russia is shooting missiles at Ukrainians. Russia also launched an energy missile at Europe, the heart of our economic and social system. And the damage is severe. And today, all of us, we must understand that we have entered a new world where many of our points of reference have been turned upside down. And we must face this situation with clarity. Russia has decided on a massive mobilization to increase its war effort tenfold. And we Europeans must also mobilize, not for war, but rather to preserve peace, to protect our security, and to guarantee the future of our children.
Ukraine has responded by asking NATO to speed up giving it membership of the US-led defense alliance. In his response, President Zelensky vowed to oust the Russians from all of Ukraine. Before Russia sent its armed forces into Ukraine in February, Moscow was demanding legally binding guarantees that Ukraine would never be admitted to NATO, a US-led military alliance. It's being claimed that Russia used this as a pretext, among others, to launch its so-called special military operation in Ukraine. And in other developments, Russian President Vladimir Putin has directly accused the United States and its allies of blowing up the Nord Stream pipelines. A sharp drop in pressure on both pipelines was registered on September the 26th, and officials detected explosions, triggering a wave of speculation about who might have sabotaged one of Russia's most important energy corridors. The European Union said it suspected sabotage caused the damage to the Gazprom-led Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines, in Swedish and Danish waters. The White House has dismissed Russian allegations it was behind the attack. Russia's top spy said that Moscow had intelligence indicating that the West was behind what he said was a terrorist act against the pipelines. Meanwhile, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says it's still too soon to speculate who might have been behind the Nord Stream pipeline ruptures.
There's a lot of speculation, but quite frankly, until complete investigation is done, no one will be able to really determine for certain what happened. I had the opportunity to speak with my counterpart in Denmark yesterday. We talked about what happened, and he pointed out to me that it will be several days before he's able to get the right team in to look at the sites and really try to determine as best possible what happened. And so until we get further information or are able to do further analysis, we won't speculate on who may have been responsible.
However, Sweden believes gas leaks along the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines are very likely the result of state action.
It's very likely that it has been done deliberately and not by accident, and it's very unlikely that it's been done by anybody else than a state without being detected earlier. And this should be seen from the current security situation that Europe is in. So other than that, I don't want to speculate currently on what the next step should be.
And the European Commission says that an escalation of the security threat by Moscow means EU member states should make stricter assessment of applications by Russians for travel visas, especially those made from third countries. EU countries have been discussing this week how to treat Russians trying to get into the bloc to avoid President Vladimir Putin's call-up for the war in Ukraine. The number of draft-age men heading abroad since President Putin called up 300,000 reservists last week has posed a dilemma for EU members, particularly Eastern countries, that had been limiting Russians' access in response to the war. It has also raised fears of possible security risks at frontiers.
President Putin will announce the illegal annexation of the 4 Ukrainian regions. This is clearly an escalation of the conflict, an escalation of the war, and that means also an escalation of the security threat towards the European Union, and we need to act to that, and we need to follow this very closely. We say we have a stricter assessment and a more thorough security assessment when it comes to new visas. Member states need to do a very thorough security assessment, and if a person could be a security threat or be a threat towards the international relation for some of the member states, this person should not be issued a visa.
And now we're back to our top story. Just a minute ago, when President Vladimir Putin announced the annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions, we have security analyst Shirin Wanu joining us on the program to take a look at that. Thank you so much for joining us on The World Today. Chidi, I hope you can hear. Yeah, good evening. What does this move mean for Ukraine? Are we seeing a repeat of Crimea?
It's a slightly, good evening, and thanks for having me on. I think it's a slightly different situation from Crimea in that with the Crimean referendum, this was a bloodless takeover. The Russians were able to take the territory without spilling Ukrainian blood. In this case, we're in the middle of an active war. The Russians do not control the entirety of the territory, nor do they have any, reasonable hope of capturing the rest of the territory. There is also, particularly in the regions of Kherson and Zaporizhia, there's very little kind of historical links to Russia. There's not a large ethnic Russian population that's been fighting against Ukrainians for years, as is the same in Donetsk or Luhansk. So it's a very specious kind of annexation, but it serves the purposes of Putin.
The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has condemned it, as well as other leaders, as a dangerous escalation. Do you see this as an escalation in the conflict?
Oh, yes, it's definitely an escalation. In what direction it escalates is the question. So the biggest issue is obviously that you are clearly violating every single UN rule in that you've illegally annexed another country. You've held a referendum on the illegally occupied territory of another country, and then you are now annexing it and taking it as your own. But more importantly, what it does is it again gives President Putin the legal fig leaf he needs to do 2 very key actions. The first is to begin the conscription of adult or fighting age males within those areas. So every man in that area who has a Russian passport, and even if you don't, is now eligible for conscription because they're now Russian citizens, which is what you see has happened in Luhansk and Donetsk, and also happened in the outlying regions of Russia. The second thing that it gives him is a legal kind of a pretext for using more, advanced weapons. So essentially, we're talking about nuclear weapons here against Ukrainians or any other power, because he can claim that he now has the legal basis to defend Russian territory, which, the use of nuclear weapons covers. So those are the 2 kind of escalatory actions that you can look at. But I think the key thing one needs to understand is that it is in essence a negotiating tactic, and it's also in essence, as I said, the important operational element is the mass mobilization, which is I think what you'll see next. But the second most important thing is that this territory is something that can now be bargained for in whatever peace talks come at the end of the war.
In response to this, Ukraine has demanded fast-track NATO membership. Is this move from Russia likely to make this happen faster than anticipated? And is Russia just going to allow this?
Ukraine will not join NATO now or in a very, very near future. So this is something that's everybody knows this. I mean, everybody knew this before the war, and everyone knows this now. One of the key NATO kind of criteria for joining the organization is that you have no existing conflicts, you have no existing internal conflicts, and you have no existing border disputes. Now, the benefit of this is that all the other countries in Eastern Europe that wanted to join NATO, they were forced to resolve all their border conflicts. So either somebody gave up territory or they agreed a sharing formula. So whether it was Poland and the Austrians, the Czechs and the Slovaks, the Hungarians and the Czechs and the Poles, everybody had to come together and resolve their existing border disputes. So a country like Ukraine that's in the middle of an active war with an external party and also in the middle of a civil war with Donetsk and Luhansk is never going to join NATO. It's all part of the negotiating and bargaining roundtable.
So how do you expect Ukraine and also its allies, I mean, apart from the condemnation and these sanctions, how do you expect them to respond to this latest move by Russia?
Well, I think the only way you can respond to this is to continue doing what you're doing. The key thing is not to back down, because this is obviously an intimidatory tactic. The only way that the Ukrainians can respond is to try and retake as much territory as possible. The more territory they take, the more ridiculous, this annexation claim becomes. And more to the point, the more territory they take, the less they have to negotiate with at the end of the war. As much as there might be a threat of nuclear weapons, that just has to be taken as a risk. There's nothing that the Ukrainians can do now beyond continue the fight, because the logic is, if you allow this precedent to stand, there's nothing stopping Putin or any other power from capturing any other country, be it Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and saying, well, I annex it now and it's mine, and if you try and take it back, I'll use nuclear weapons. So the Ukrainians have to fight. Unfortunately for them, the West will have to continue its support. The West, as in people like ourselves, will have to suffer through this winter with high gas prices, high energy prices. And come next year, there will be a counteroffensive and the Russians will most likely be defeated.
All right, then, Chidinwanu, security analyst, thank you so much for your thoughts on the program.
Thanks for having me.